Marcus Blackwell had ruled the vampire clans for over 3 centuries, commanding respect through fear and absolute authority. His mansion in the hills overlooking the city stood as a fortress of dark stone and iron gates, where no mortal dared to venture after sunset. But, tonight, something had changed everything. The ancient vampire king, who had never shown weakness to anyone, stood helplessly in his grand library holding a crying infant. The baby had appeared on his doorstep 3 nights ago, wrapped in a simple white blanket with a note that read, "Your son, born of love and darkness." She cannot care for him anymore. Marcus knew immediately who had left the child. Elena Rosewood, the human woman he had fallen in love with during a business trip to London 6 months earlier. She had disappeared without explanation after their brief but passionate affair, and now he understood why. The infant, who appeared to be about 2 months old, possessed the unmistakable features of the Blackwell bloodline. Dark hair that seemed to shimmer in candlelight, pale skin that felt cool to the touch, and, most telling of all, eyes that shifted between deep blue and crimson when the child became upset. This was indeed his son, a hybrid creature that should not have been possible according to ancient vampire law. But the child would not stop crying. For 3 consecutive nights, the baby had wailed with such intensity that even Marcus's supernatural hearing felt assaulted. He had tried everything he could think of. The finest cribs money could buy, imported silk clothing, temperature adjustments, feeding attempts with various formulas, and even hiring a human nanny who fled in terror after witnessing the child's eyes glow red during a particularly intense crying session. Marcus had never felt so powerless in his immortal life. He who had commanded armies, negotiated with world leaders, and built a business empire spanning multiple continents found himself defeated by a 2-month-old infant. The baby's cries seemed to pierce not just his ears but something deeper, touching emotions he had buried centuries ago when he first embraced his vampire nature. His personal assistant, David Chen, entered the library with obvious reluctance. David was one of the few humans who worked directly for Marcus, having proven his loyalty and discretion over 15 years of service. The man looked exhausted, his usually pristine suit wrinkled from lack of sleep. "Sir, I've contacted every pediatrician in the city," David reported, keeping his voice low to avoid startling the crying child. "None of them will make house calls at night, and those I spoke with during the day mentioned that the symptoms you described could indicate anything from colic to more serious medical conditions. They all recommended bringing the child to a hospital for proper examination." Marcus shook his head firmly. Taking his son to a hospital was impossible. Too many questions would be asked, tests would be run, and the child's hybrid nature would inevitably be discovered. The Vampire Council had ancient laws about exposure to the human world, and Marcus himself had enforced these rules ruthlessly throughout his reign. He could not risk the safety of all vampire kind for one child, even his own son. "What about the feeding?" Marcus asked, gently bouncing the baby in his arms as the crying continued. "Have you researched hybrid nutritional requirements?" David consulted his tablet, scrolling through extensive notes. "The information is extremely limited, sir. Most sources suggest that hybrid children can initially survive on human formula, but may eventually require alternative nutrition as they develop. However, the timing and specifics vary greatly according to the few documented cases I could find in the ancient texts." The baby's cries intensified, and Marcus felt a strange sensation in his chest that he had not experienced in centuries. It was fear, but not for himself. He was afraid for this tiny, helpless creature who depended entirely on him. The realization was both terrifying and profound. When had he last cared about someone else's well-being more than his own survival? "Sir, if I may suggest," David continued cautiously, "perhaps the child needs something beyond physical care. Human infants often require emotional comfort, bonding, and constant attention from their primary caregiver. You've been handling the practical aspects, but perhaps the child senses your uncertainty and fear." Marcus looked down at his son's red, scrunched face as the baby continued to wail. The suggestion stung because it contained truth. He had approached parenting like a business problem to be solved rather than a relationship to be built. But how could he form an emotional bond with a child when he had spent centuries suppressing his own emotions? How could he provide comfort when he himself felt completely lost? As if sensing his father's internal struggle, the baby's cries reached a new level of desperation. The sound echoed through the mansion's halls, causing several of Marcus's vampire staff members to retreat to the lower levels. Even they, with their supernatural tolerance for various forms of distress, found the infant's cries unbearable. Marcus made a decision that surprised even himself. "David, prepare the car. We're going out." His assistant looked startled. "Sir, it's nearly midnight. Where exactly are we going with a crying infant?" "Somewhere that's still open. Somewhere with people who might have experience with children." Marcus wrapped the baby more securely in his blanket, noting how the child seemed to calm slightly at the gentle pressure. "There's an all-night diner downtown, isn't there? The one where we sometimes conduct late-night business meetings?" David nodded slowly. "Rosie's Diner on 5th Street. But, sir, bringing the child into public is necessary," Marcus finished firmly. "I cannot help him if I don't understand what he needs. And, clearly, my current approach is failing entirely." Within minutes, Marcus found himself in the backseat of his Mercedes sedan, still holding his crying son while David navigated the empty city streets toward downtown. This was the first time in over 50 years that Marcus had ventured into public with a personal problem rather than business concerns. The vulnerability was foreign and uncomfortable, but his son's distress outweighed his own discomfort. The city looked different from this perspective. Instead of viewing it as territory to be controlled or resources to be managed, Marcus saw it as a place where people lived their daily lives, where they faced struggles and found solutions. Perhaps somewhere in this ordinary human world, he could find answers that his supernatural existence had not provided. Rosie's Diner sat on a corner lot, its neon sign flickering against the night sky. Through the windows, Marcus could see several late-night customers, a police officer finishing his shift, a nurse grabbing food between hospital rotations, a taxi driver taking a break, and a young woman in a waitress uniform moving efficiently between tables. The scene looked so normal, so far removed from his world of ancient traditions and supernatural politics. As David parked the car, Marcus felt his son's cries beginning to subside slightly, as if the change in environment had provided some distraction. For the first time in 3 days, Marcus allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, he might find the help he desperately needed in the most unlikely of places. Sarah Martinez had been working the night shift at Rosie's Diner for 3 years, ever since her divorce left her struggling to support herself and pay for her nursing school classes during the day. At 28, she had developed an intuitive understanding of people who found themselves in diners at odd hours. Most of them were running from something or towards something, rarely satisfied with where they currently stood in life. She noticed the expensive black sedan pull up outside immediately. Vehicles like that didn't typically stop at Rosie's, especially not at 12:30 in the morning. The diner usually attracted construction workers, hospital staff, police officers, and the occasional insomniac seeking coffee and companionship. When she saw the impeccably dressed man emerge from the back seat carrying what appeared to be a crying baby, her nursing training kicked in before her curiosity. Marcus Blackwell entered the diner with his son still whimpering softly against his chest. The fluorescent lighting felt harsh after the dim ambience of his mansion, and the smell of coffee and grilled food was overwhelming to his enhanced senses. But his son's breathing seemed to steady slightly in the warmer, more populated environment, giving Marcus hope that this impromptu expedition might yield results. Sarah approached their table within moments of them being seated. She had wiped her hands clean and grabbed a glass of water, her movements efficient but gentle. Years of nursing training had taught her to assess situations quickly, and she immediately noticed several concerning details about the man and baby before her. The baby appeared healthy but distressed, with the kind of red, exhausted face that suggested hours of crying. The man holding him looked equally exhausted, though in a different way. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his usually perfect hair disheveled, and his hands shook slightly with fatigue. Most telling, however, was the way he held the child awkwardly, like someone who genuinely cared but had no practical experience with infant care. "Can I get you some coffee?" Sarah asked softly, automatically lowering her voice around the fussy baby. "And maybe something to eat?" Marcus nodded gratefully. "Coffee would be excellent. Black, please. And, perhaps." He hesitated, looking down at his son. "Do you have experience with children?" The question was so direct and vulnerable that Sarah felt her professional instincts engage completely. She had seen this look before in the hospital, usually on the faces of new fathers who found themselves overwhelmed by the reality of caring for a tiny human being. She answered honestly. I'm studying to be a pediatric nurse, and I've worked with infants during my clinical rotations. Is everything okay with your baby? Marcus felt relief wash over him at her matter-of-fact tone. No judgment, no invasive questions about why he was in a diner at midnight with a crying infant. Just professional concern and an offer of help. He's been crying for 3 days straight, Marcus admitted quietly. I've tried everything I can think of, but nothing seems to comfort him. His mother. He paused, choosing his words carefully. His mother is no longer available to help, and I'm finding myself completely out of my depth. Sarah nodded understandingly. She had seen single fathers struggle with infant care before, especially when circumstances had thrust them into the role unexpectedly. Something about this particular situation tugged at her heart, though she couldn't identify exactly what it was. May I? She asked, gesturing toward the baby. Marcus hesitated for just a moment before carefully transferring his son to Sarah's experienced arms. The change was remarkable. Within seconds of being held by Sarah, the baby's cries diminished to soft whimpers, then gradually faded to curious silence. Sarah had positioned him slightly differently, supporting his head and neck more naturally, and was gently swaying in the subtle rhythm that most nurses learn through practice with countless infants. He's beautiful, Sarah said softly, studying the baby's features. How old is he? About 2 months, Marcus replied, watching in amazement as his son seemed to relax completely for the first time since arriving at the mansion. How did you do that? Sarah smiled, continuing her gentle swaying motion. Sometimes babies just need to feel secure and calm. He was probably picking up on your stress and uncertainty, which made him more upset, which made you more stressed, and so on. It's a common cycle with new parents. She examined the baby more closely, noting his pale skin and unusually dark hair. Something about his features seemed distinctive, almost aristocratic. Has he been eating well? Sleeping at all between the crying episodes? Marcus shook his head. He takes very little formula, and sleep has been nearly impossible. I've had pediatricians consulted, but... He trailed off, realizing he couldn't explain the supernatural complications that made traditional medical advice insufficient. Sometimes babies go through difficult periods, Sarah said thoughtfully. Colic, growth spurts, developmental changes. But 3 days of constant crying is concerning. She looked directly at Marcus. I hope you don't mind me asking, but are you a single father? The question hit Marcus unexpectedly hard. Was he a single father? The label seemed both accurate and completely inadequate to describe his situation. Yes, he said finally. His mother and the relationship ended. She left him with me, and I'm trying to figure out how to care for him properly. Sarah's expression softened with sympathy. She had seen many fathers struggle with sudden single parenthood, but something about Marcus seemed different. There was an intensity to his concern for the child that went beyond normal parental worry. It was almost desperate, as if the baby's well-being represented something larger than just paternal duty. What's his name? She asked, adjusting the baby's position as he began to drift toward sleep for the first time in days. Marcus realized with some embarrassment that he hadn't actually chosen a name yet. He had been so focused on the practical aspects of keeping the child alive and healthy that he hadn't moved beyond thinking of him simply as his son. I haven't decided yet, he admitted. Everything happened very suddenly. Sarah nodded without judgment. That's okay. Sometimes it takes time to find the right name. She looked down at the now peaceful baby. He seems to respond well to gentle voices and steady movement. Have you tried skin-to-skin contact? It can be very calming for infants, especially when they're feeling insecure or overstimulated. Marcus had not tried skin-to-skin contact, primarily because his naturally cool body temperature made him uncertain about whether such contact would be beneficial or potentially harmful to his son. But watching Sarah's natural ease with the child made him realize how much he had been overthinking every aspect of care. I haven't, he said quietly. I'd been concerned about temperature differences and other factors. Babies are more resilient than most people think, Sarah assured him. As long as you're gentle and attentive to his cues, he'll let you know what he needs. As she spoke, the baby opened his eyes and looked directly at Marcus. For a moment, father and son simply stared at each other, and Marcus felt something shift inside his chest. The fear was still there, but underneath it was something else, love, pure and uncomplicated. This tiny being was his responsibility, his family, his future in a way that no business venture or political alliance had ever been. Sarah noticed the exchange and smiled. He knows you're his father. Look how he focuses on your face. Marcus reached out tentatively to touch his son's small hand, and the baby immediately grasped his finger with surprising strength. The contact sent an unexpected wave of emotion through Marcus that he struggled to process. For centuries, he had believed that vampires were incapable of the kind of selfless love that humans experienced. Yet here he was, willing to risk everything for this small creature who shared his blood. The thing about babies, Sarah continued, her voice taking on a teaching tone that came naturally from her nursing background, is that they don't need you to be perfect. They just need you to be present and consistent. The fact that you brought him here, that you're seeking help instead of giving up, tells me you're going to be a good father. The words hit Marcus more profoundly than any business negotiation or political maneuvering ever had. A good father. He had never imagined that phrase could apply to him, someone who had built his existence around power, control, and emotional distance. Yet here was this human woman, the stranger, offering him both practical help and emotional reassurance without expecting anything in return. Would you like me to show you a few techniques that might help when he gets fussy again? Sarah offered. I have a break coming up in a few minutes, and, honestly, it would be good practice for me too. Marcus nodded gratefully. I would appreciate that more than you know. As Sarah continued to hold his sleeping son, Marcus found himself studying her face. She had kind eyes and an easy competence that spoke of genuine care for others. Her uniform was slightly wrinkled from a long shift, and her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, but there was something about her that radiated warmth and reliability. For the first time since his son had arrived, Marcus began to believe that maybe he wasn't as alone in this challenge as he had thought. Maybe there were people in the world willing to help, even a vampire king too proud to ask for assistance until desperation drove him to an all-night diner at midnight. Over the following weeks, Marcus found himself returning to Rosie's diner more frequently than he had ever imagined possible. What had begun as a desperate midnight visit had evolved into a routine that both surprised and comforted him. Sarah's shifts ran from 11 at night until 7 in the morning, which aligned perfectly with his nocturnal schedule and his son's seemingly reversed sleep patterns. The baby, whom Marcus had finally named Alexander after realizing that the child deserved a name that reflected both strength and the new beginning he represented, had begun to thrive under the combined care of his father and the patient guidance of Sarah Martinez. The crying episodes had decreased dramatically once Marcus learned proper holding techniques, feeding schedules, and the importance of maintaining calm energy around an infant who seemed unusually sensitive to emotional atmospheres. Sarah had become more than just a helpful stranger. She had appointed herself as an unofficial consultant in Marcus's crash course in parenthood, offering advice during her breaks and even researching infant development topics during her free time. She never asked invasive questions about Marcus's background or the circumstances that had led to his sudden single fatherhood, accepting his vague explanations about business demands and complicated family situations. What Sarah didn't know, and what Marcus struggled with daily, was how to balance his growing dependence on her help with the dangerous reality of his true nature. Every night he spent in the diner with Alexander, every conversation with Sarah about infant care and parenting strategies brought them closer to a friendship that could potentially expose both her and his son to the supernatural world he was trying to protect them from. Marcus had also begun to notice changes in Alexander that confirmed his suspicions about his son's hybrid nature. The baby's sleep schedule remained completely nocturnal, he showed unusual alertness in dim lighting while seeming uncomfortable with bright fluorescence, and his rate of development appeared accelerated compared to normal infant milestones. Most concerning, Alexander had begun refusing all traditional infant formulas, accepting only a specially prepared mixture that Marcus had developed with help from vampire nutritional specialists. These supernatural elements of Alexander's care were aspects that Marcus couldn't discuss with Sarah, despite her increasingly detailed questions about the baby's dietary preferences and unusual behavioral patterns. He found himself crafting careful explanations about family genetic traits and consulting specialists without being able to share the true complexity of raising a half-vampire child. On a particularly quiet Thursday night, Sarah noticed that Marcus seemed more tense than usual. Alexander was sleeping peacefully in his carrier beside their usual corner booth, but Marcus kept checking his phone and glancing toward the windows as if expecting something troubling to arrive. "Everything okay?" Sarah asked during her break, sliding into the seat across from him. "You seem on edge tonight." Marcus looked up from his untouched coffee, realizing that his growing comfort with Sarah had led him to become less careful about hiding his concerns. "Family obligations," he said carefully. "There are some people who disapprove of my recent lifestyle changes." This was both true and a vast understatement. The Vampire Council had been pressuring Marcus for weeks to explain his frequent absences from clan business and his neglect of traditional vampire social obligations. Several council members had begun investigating his activities, and Marcus knew it was only a matter of time before they discovered Alexander's existence. When that happened, both his son and Sarah could be in danger. Sarah nodded understandingly. Family can be complicated, especially when you're making major life changes. "Are they pressuring you about raising Alexander alone?" "Something like that," Marcus replied. "They believe I'm making choices that could have serious consequences for everyone involved." "But you're doing a great job," Sarah said earnestly. "I've watched you with Alexander over the past few weeks, and you've gone from a terrified new father to someone who genuinely understands his child's needs. That kind of learning curve is impressive, especially under what I assume are stressful circumstances." Marcus felt the familiar surge of emotion that Sarah's encouragement always provoked. Her faith in his parenting abilities meant more to him than she could possibly understand, particularly because it came from someone whose judgment he had grown to trust completely. "Sarah," he began, then paused, uncertain how to express what he wanted to say. "Your help these past weeks. I want you to know that Alexander and I both owe you more than we can repay. You've been extraordinarily kind to strangers who had no claim on your time or expertise." Sarah smiled softly. "You're not strangers anymore. And, honestly, helping you too has been rewarding for me as well. It's good practice for my career goals, and..." She hesitated, seeming to choose her words carefully. "I've enjoyed getting to know you both. You're different from most of the people I encounter." The comment was innocent enough, but it reminded Marcus of the fundamental deception at the heart of their relationship. Sarah believed she was helping a businessman struggling with unexpected single fatherhood. She had no idea she was providing care guidance for a vampire's hybrid son, or that her kindness was being offered to a creature who could potentially be dangerous to her. "Different how?" Marcus asked quietly. "You're more formal than most people, but also more thoughtful. You listen carefully when I explain things, you remember everything I tell you, and you genuinely care about doing right by Alexander even when it's difficult or inconvenient." Sarah paused, studying his face. "Most people want quick fixes or easy answers. You're willing to put in the work to actually understand what he needs." Marcus realized that Sarah was describing qualities that had nothing to do with his vampire nature and everything to do with the man he was choosing to become through fatherhood. For the first time in his long existence, someone was seeing him not as a powerful supernatural being or a business leader, but simply as a person trying his best to care for someone he loved. "There's something I should tell you," Marcus said suddenly, the words coming before he could stop them. Sarah looked at him expectantly, her expression open and patient. Marcus struggled with how much truth he could safely share. "Alexander's situation is more complicated than I've explained. His mother, she left him with me because she believed I could provide a kind of protection that she couldn't. There are aspects of his care that require very specific knowledge and resources." "What kind of specific knowledge?" Sarah asked, her nursing training evident in the professional way she approached the question. "Genetic factors," Marcus said carefully. "My family has some unusual hereditary traits that affect diet, sleep patterns, and development. Alexander is showing signs that he's inherited these traits, which means he'll need specialized care as he grows." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "That would explain some of the things I've noticed. His nocturnal schedule, his sensitivity to lighting, his unusual dietary requirements. Are these traits that will require ongoing medical monitoring? Marcus felt relieved that Sarah's medical background allowed her to accept unusual circumstances without excessive questioning. Yes, ongoing monitoring and very specific care protocols. Which is why. He hesitated again. I may need to make some changes soon that could affect how often I'm able to bring him here. The thought of losing her regular contact with Sarah and Alexander clearly disappointed Sarah, though she tried to hide it. Of course. I understand that his medical needs have to come first. But, before that happens, Marcus continued, making a decision that surprised him, would you consider providing some of that specialized care on a more formal basis? Sarah looked confused. What do you mean? I mean, would you be interested in a position as Alexander's private care provider? Someone who could help manage his specific needs while continuing your nursing education? Marcus had not planned to make this offer, but, suddenly, it seemed like the perfect solution to multiple problems. The compensation would be substantial, and the schedule could be arranged around your school requirements. Sarah stared at him for a long moment. You're offering me a job as Alexander's nanny? More than a nanny. A specialized care provider who understands both his medical needs and his emotional development. Someone who could help ensure his well-being while I handle the other aspects of our family situation. The offer was tempting for multiple reasons, Sarah realized. The financial security would allow her to focus on her studies without worrying about diner shifts. She had genuinely grown attached to Alexander, and working with Marcus would provide valuable experience for her nursing career. But something about the situation felt incomplete, as if there were important details she wasn't being told. Can I ask why you're offering this to me specifically? She said finally. You could hire any qualified childcare professional. Marcus looked down at Alexander, who was beginning to stir in his carrier. Because he trusts you. In 3 days of constant crying, you were the first person who could calm him. Because you care about his well-being, not just completing assigned tasks. And, because. He looked back at Sarah. Because I trust you. The simple statement carried more weight than Marcus had intended. Trust was not something he offered easily, and certainly not to humans he had known for only a few weeks. But Sarah had proven herself trustworthy in ways both large and small, and his instincts told him that she would protect Alexander as fiercely as she would her own child. Sarah felt the gravity of his trust and the responsibility he was offering her. If I accepted this position, what exactly would it involve? Helping care for Alexander during evening and night hours, learning about his specific dietary and medical requirements, providing companionship and stimulation appropriate for his development, and... Marcus paused, knowing this next part would sound unusual. Maintaining absolute confidentiality about our family's private circumstances. Confidentiality I can definitely provide, Sarah said. And I'm interested in learning more about specialized pediatric care. But I would need to understand more about what makes his situation so unique. Marcus nodded. That's fair. There are things I can explain and demonstrate, and others that you would learn through experience. Would you be willing to visit our home to see the care environment and meet the rest of our household staff? The invitation represented a significant risk for Marcus, but also a necessary step if this arrangement was going to work. Sarah would need to understand at least some aspects of Alexander's supernatural requirements, and she would need to see that the mansion's staff could be trusted to support her efforts. I would like that, Sarah said. When were you thinking? Tomorrow night, if that works for your schedule. I could have David collect you after your shift here ends. As if summoned by his name, David Chen approached their table, looking slightly uncomfortable but maintaining his professional demeanor. Mr. Blackwell, forgive the interruption, but there's been a development that requires your attention. Marcus tensed immediately. David's presence at the diner meant that whatever had happened was serious enough to warrant tracking him down during his private time with Alexander. What kind of development? Council-related, David said quietly, glancing meaningfully at Sarah. Marcus understood immediately. The Vampire Council had made some kind of move regarding his recent behavior changes. This was exactly the kind of family pressure he had mentioned to Sarah, but with potentially dangerous consequences that he couldn't explain to her. I'll need to handle this tonight, Marcus said, reaching for Alexander's carrier. "Sarah, would it be possible to move our planned visit to tomorrow night? There's an urgent family matter I need to address." Sarah nodded, though she couldn't help noticing the way David's arrival had instantly changed Marcus's entire demeanor from relaxed to tense. "Of course. Is everything all right?" "It will be," Marcus said firmly, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely certain of that. "David will contact you tomorrow with the details for our meeting." As Marcus prepared to leave with Alexander, Sarah found herself hoping that whatever family complications he was facing wouldn't interfere with the opportunity he had offered her. She had grown more attached to both father and son than she cared to admit, and the prospect of becoming a more permanent part of their lives appealed to her in ways that went beyond professional interest. What she didn't realize was that Marcus was facing a choice between the supernatural world that had defined his existence for centuries and the new life he was building around his son and the remarkable human woman who had helped them both when they needed it most. The Vampire Council's summons represented a test of priorities that would determine not just Alexander's future, but the kind of man and father Marcus was choosing to become.